In the winter of 1989, every grain elevator in Calhoun County, Illinois, ran the same conveyor system. This was not a choice anyone made consciously. It was the way the Mississippi bottomland ran flat toward the bluffs, the way the harvest came in hard in October, the way the mud dried to concrete by November, and the semis lined up 3 deep waiting to unload. Meridian belt conveyor systems, 18-inch galvanized steel, sealed roller bearings, 5-year service agreement, maintained out of a regional equipment dealership on Route 96 called Consolidated Ag Equipment. That was what you ran. That was what your neighbors ran. That was what the elevator 2 counties north ran, and the one 2 counties south. Not because anyone had compared alternatives. Because Consolidated had the territory, and in territory, alternatives do not present themselves unless you go looking for them. Let me tell you about Lowell Gerber, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with 11 years and a barn full of other people's cast-offs. Lowell was 52 years old in 1989 and had operated the same 480-acre grain farm outside of Hardin, Illinois, for 26 years. His father, Raymond, had bought the ground in 1955 after coming back from Korea with a bad left knee and a determination to own something that could not be transferred or repossessed. Raymond had built the first equipment shed himself, poured the concrete floor himself, framed the walls with lumber milled from the silver maples along the creek. Lowell had been 8 years old the summer that shed went up. He had carried boards and held things and fetched nails and learned the way children learn when they are in the presence of someone doing a thing correctly. That is, without being told anything directly. By 1989, Lowell had 2 grain handling systems on his property. He ran Meridian conveyors on one of them because that was what the dealer had sold him in 1977 when he expanded the elevator bin setup. The other system he had built himself in stages over 10 years using components he had sourced from 3 different manufacturers. At the center of the system he had built himself were 2 conveyor drives salvaged from a closed feed mill in Campsville. They were older, they were heavy. They were chain-driven rather than belt-driven, and their casings were cast iron rather than sheet steel, and they weighed approximately twice what the Meridian units weighed. They were also still running exactly as they had been built to run, which was at a lower RPM, at higher torque, with no meaningful sensitivity to the fine grain dust and limestone grit that the bottomland corn carried off the field and into every bearing and seal and motor housing in Calhoun County. Lowell understood why this mattered. He had grown up watching grain dust destroy equipment. He had seen it pack into bearing housings and score shaft journals and build up in motor windings until the heat could not escape and the insulation failed. He had pulled apart enough failed Meridian units on his own system to understand exactly how they failed. The sealed roller bearings on the Meridian design were sealed for dust ingress ratings that assumed a controlled indoor environment. The grain elevator environment in Calhoun County was not a controlled indoor environment. It was a rotating column of fine corn bran and limestone particulate and chaff and the occasional live weevil, and the Meridian sealed bearings treated all of that particulate as an attack rather than a condition to be accommodated. The chain drives on the old Campsville units treated it differently. The chain drive system was open rather than sealed. It ran in an oil bath. Particulate that entered the housing entered the oil and either settled or was filtered by the mesh screen on the drain plug. The chain itself had enough tolerance in its pitch that a little grit in the oil did not measurably accelerate wear. Lowell had pulled the drives from his Campsville units for inspection after 5 years of running and found the chain pitch within 2% of specification and the sprocket teeth showing wear patterns that indicated at least another decade of service life. He had written that down in a spiral notebook he kept on the workbench shelf. He wrote down most things. The man who ran Consolidated Ag Equipment was named Fletcher Dowd, and Fletcher Dowd was everything that a dealership territory produces when the territory is large enough and the alternatives are few enough. He was 58 years old in 1989, a large man with a large handshake, and the kind of easy confidence that comes from having sold the same product line to the same customer base for long enough that the confidence has stopped being a performance and become simply his posture in the world. He had built Consolidated from a two-man shop to a 14-employee operation with serviced territories in 4 counties. He carried the Meridian line exclusively. He had the elevator service contracts for 11 co-ops in the region. He had been the primary conveyor dealer for Calhoun County since 1971, which was 3 years before Lowell Gerber had even installed his first conveyor system. When Fletcher Dowd told an elevator operator what to buy, the elevator operator bought it. That was the arrangement. That was how territory worked. Let me tell you about what Fletcher Dowd did with failed conveyor drives, because that is where the story actually begins. The Meridian units failed at a rate that Fletcher managed rather than solved. When a sealed bearing went on a conveyor drive, the standard protocol was to pull the unit, swap in a new one from stock, and send the failed unit back to Meridian's regional depot for warranty assessment. The depot would assess the unit, declare it non-rebuildable under warranty terms if the bearing failure had allowed shaft deflection, or if the belt tensioner had been damaged, and ship it back to Consolidated marked for disposal. Fletcher Dowd did not dispose of them. He had a lean-to attached to the back of the main shop building, cinder block walls, a metal roof that drummed when it rained, and a concrete floor that had cracked along one wall from frost heave. The failed drives went in the lean-to. By 1991, there were 9 of them. By 1995, there were 23. By 1999, the number was somewhere north of 40, stacked on wooden pallets that had begun to soften at the corners from sitting on damp concrete. Fletcher was not keeping them for any reason. He was simply not getting around to the alternative. Let me tell you about what Lowell Gerber noticed, because he had been noticing things for a long time before he said anything about them. Lowell had a service account at Consolidated. He bought belting and lubricant and the occasional motor there. Even though he serviced most of his own equipment, he came in on a Tuesday morning in June of 1996 to pick up a case of chain oil and some sprocket link pins, and while he was waiting for the parts counter to pull his order, he walked around the side of the building. The lean-to door was propped open with a chunk of creosote timber. He stood at the opening for a moment and looked at the stacked drives inside. He could see the Meridian housings, the familiar blue-painted cast iron, the bolt patterns he had memorized from his own equipment. He could see the condition of them. Not rotted, not crushed, sitting. He went back to the parts counter and collected his order and drove home. That evening he called Fletcher Dowd. He told Fletcher he had seen the drives in the lean-to. He told Fletcher he thought he might be able to use some of them, not all, but some. He explained that the Meridian drive housings used a frame bolt pattern that was compatible with the chain drive sprocket assembly from the older Campsville-style units if you had the right adapter plate, and that he had been working through the geometry on paper for a few weeks, and he believed the conversion was achievable within the existing housing envelope without machining the housing itself. He told Fletcher he would take the drives off his hands, clear out the lean-to, and if the experiment produced anything useful, he would let Fletcher know what he found. The silence on Fletcher's end lasted about 3 seconds. Then Fletcher said, with the patient tone of a man who has heard many things in 14 years of territory, that those units were assessed non-rebuildable by Meridian's own depot, that a chain drive conversion inside a sealed bearing housing was not something any manufacturer would support or document, that Lowell was welcome to play around in his shop if he wanted to, but that Fletcher would not be responsible for what happened if Lowell put a cobbled-up unit on a commercial elevator and it failed during a harvest run when someone's semi was sitting in the pit. He said, "Cobbled up the way people say things they believe before they have had reason to examine the belief." Lowell said he understood. He asked if he could have the drives. Fletcher said, "Sure, come get them." He had been meaning to clear that lean-to since 1993. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 11 years, because the time matters as much as anything else. Lowell borrowed a flatbed from his neighbor, a retired machinist named Art Schumacher, and made 2 trips to Consolidated over a Thursday and Friday in late June. He came away with 38 drive units, plus a collection of loose components in a steel drum that Fletcher had let him take, tensioner arms, bearing cartridges, key stock, things that had accumulated on the lean-to floor alongside the stacked units. He put the drives on wooden pallets in the east bay of his equipment barn off the floor, with cardboard between the pallets and the concrete to catch moisture wicking. He tied a piece of orange flagging to each unit and marked them with a paint pen. He started a new spiral notebook. What he found when he began teardown was more or less what he had expected. 21 of the 38 units had motor windings that were burned past economic rebuild. The insulation had failed, the windings had shorted, the rotors had seized, and the resulting shaft deflection had wallowed out the bearing seats in the housing. He set those aside without sentimentality. They were parts donors. The belt tensioner arms on most of them were intact. The housing bolts were intact. The housings themselves were cast iron, and cast iron does not care about a failed bearing the way an aluminum housing would. 17 units had motors that were serviceable or recoverable. Continuity tests came back clean on the windings. The bearing failures had been caught early enough, or the units had failed for other reasons entirely. Tensioner slippage, belt tracking issues, things that had nothing to do with the bearing design, and the motors had come through undamaged. Those 17 went on the bench. The housings were a different matter entirely, and this was the part Lowell had been thinking about for 2 years. The Meridian housing was overbuilt for its intended drive. Cast iron, 4-bolt mounting, internal dimensions that Lowell had measured and noted were within a 1/4 inch in 2 directions of the chain drive assembly dimensions on the Campsville units, not identical. Close enough that an adapter plate, not an adapter coupling like the pump story, but a flat plate, laser cut or precision milled to step the bolt circle down, would allow a chain drive sprocket assembly to be fitted into the existing housing envelope. He called a man named Russell at a steel fabrication shop in Pittsfield. He had dealt with Russell for 15 years on various projects. He explained what he needed. He had drawn it up on graph paper, both the plate geometry and the sprocket bore modification. Russell looked at the drawing Lowell faxed him and called back the next morning to say he could have the plates in 10 days and that the modification was straightforward. Lowell said he would need 14 to start, with the possibility of more. Let me tell you about why what Lowell was building worked, because the engineering matters, and you should understand it before you hear what happened when it did. A sealed roller bearing conveyor drive and a chain drive system in an oil bath handle the same operating environment in fundamentally different ways. The sealed bearing assumes that if you keep contamination out, the bearing will last. That assumption is sound in a clean environment. In a grain elevator handling bottomland corn in southern Illinois in October, with humidity at 60% and fine particulate suspended in the air at concentrations that would require a dust mask. If you stood there long enough, the assumption breaks down. Particulate enters. Seals are not absolute barriers. They are time-delayed barriers, and once particulate is inside a sealed bearing, it cannot leave. It stays. It scores the races. It generates heat. The bearing fails. The chain drive in an oil bath does not make that assumption. It does not assume the environment is clean. It assumes the environment contains particulate. The oil carries the particulate. The particulate settles. The chain and sprockets wear, but they wear predictably, at a rate that can be measured, at a rate that the design anticipated. You can see the wear. You can measure it. You can decide when to replace the chain based on actual pitch measurement, rather than waiting for a bearing to fail catastrophically during an October run with 60,000 bushels of corn waiting to be unloaded. Lowell had run the chain drives from Campsville for 12 years before he started this project. He had replaced chain twice. He had replaced sprockets once on one of the two units. He had not had a single unscheduled shutdown. He had never pulled a drive in the middle of harvest. That was the metric that mattered to a farmer, not the purchase price of the unit. The probability of standing in a grain elevator at 7 in the morning on October 14th with the first semi already pulling in and the drive sitting dead on the concrete because a bearing let go at midnight. He rebuilt the first converted unit in January of 1997. He ran it on a test stand he had built in the barn, a platform with a motor controller and a hopper that fed a simulated grain stream through the housing at a dust concentration he had calculated from the elevator air quality data the county extension office had on file from a study done in 1991. He ran the unit for 48 hours. He pulled it, disassembled it, measured every wear surface, checked chain pitch with a pitch gauge and calipers, and recorded the numbers in the notebook. He ran it for another 48 hours, same result. Chain pitch within spec. Oil cloudy, with fine particulate but clear of any metal filings that would indicate accelerated wear on the sprocket teeth. He called Russell in Pittsfield and read him the number. Russell said he had done a lot of adaptation work in 30 years, and those were better numbers than he would have expected. Lowell said he knew. He said the chain did not fight the dust. It just moved through it. Over the next 4 years, working in the barn during winter months and wet stretches when field work was not possible, Lowell converted the remaining 16 serviceable units. He was not hurrying. He had his farm to run. He had his own equipment to maintain. By the spring of 2001, 17 complete converted drives were on pallets in the East Bay, tagged and documented and tested. He had spent a little over $9,000 on fabrication, chain and sprocket components, motor rebuilds, and materials. 17 new Meridian units from Consolidated would have cost approximately $54,000 at 2001 prices. He did not tell Fletcher Dowd any of this. Let me tell you about what was happening at Consolidated Ag Equipment during those same years, because the story always has two tracks. Fletcher Dowd had continued selling Meridian units through the 90s. The bearing failures had continued at their established rate. Fletcher had developed a service model around the failures that generated consistent revenue. Pull the unit, swap in a new one from his service van, bill the labor and the markup on the replacement, schedule the next service check. It was a system. The farmers in Calhoun County paid for it because they did not know there was an alternative, and because in October, in the middle of a harvest run, you pay whatever you have to pay to get the elevator running again. In 2000, Meridian was acquired by a larger regional manufacturer that renegotiated the dealer service agreement. The new agreement increased the parts markup Consolidated was required to charge customers, and simultaneously reduced the dealer warranty recovery rate on failed units. Fletcher's margin on service work compressed. He raised his labor rate to compensate. Two of his senior technicians left for the competing line that had moved into the adjacent county. By 2003, Consolidated was running 8 employees in a shop built for 14. Fletcher was still the largest ag equipment dealer in Calhoun County. His name was still on the sign, but the sign needed painting. In the fall of 2003, a farmer named Boyd Ketterman, who ran 360 acres east of Hardin on the flat ground along the river, had a conveyor drive fail. It was a Meridian unit, 3 years old, the second bearing failure on the same drive since he had bought it. Fletcher's service technician pulled it and told Boyd the motor was burned and the housing bore was wallowed and the unit needed to be replaced. New unit installed, labor included, came to $1,900. Boyd Ketterman called Lowell Gerber that same afternoon. Lowell told him to come over in the morning. Boyd walked through the east bay of Lowell's barn the next day looking at the converted units on their pallets. Lowell pulled the service notebook and showed him the test records. He showed Boyd the chain pitch measurements from the 48-hour runs. He explained the dust accommodation logic in plain language, not engineering language. The way a man explains something to his neighbor when he has been thinking about it for 10 years and wants the neighbor to actually understand it rather than just agree with it. He told Boyd the drive would cost him $800 installed and that he would do the installation himself. He told Boyd that if the drive failed within 2 years for any reason related to his conversion, he would replace it at no charge. Boyd said he needed the elevator running before the end of the week. Lowell installed the drive on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the elevator was running. The amp draw on the motor was within 4% of specification. The chain tension was nominal. The unit ran quietly in a way that the Meridian units, even new, had not always run quietly. Boyd Ketterman mentioned it at the grain elevator in town the following Saturday, and then he mentioned it again at the co-op on Monday. And Lowell Gerber's phone started ringing in a way it had not previously rung. By the following spring, Lowell had installed 9 of his converted drives for neighboring operations. By the fall of 2004, he had installed 14. None of them had failed. He had not gotten a single call back. Let me tell you about how Fletcher Dowd heard, because men in territory always hear things in the same way. 3 different people at 3 different locations told him the same thing inside of 2 weeks. The third one, a parts counter customer named Irvin, who ran a small elevator near Hamburg, told Fletcher that he had heard Lowell Gerber was selling converted conveyor drives out of his barn for $800 installed, and that 2 of his own neighbors were running them and happy about it. Fletcher drove out to Lowell's farm on a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2004. He did not call ahead. He pulled into the yard, and Lowell came out of the barn with a chain wrench in one hand and grease on both forearms, and he looked at Fletcher standing by his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he said hello. Fletcher said he had heard Lowell was selling drives. Lowell said he was not selling them. He was installing them for his neighbors at cost. Fletcher said that sounded like selling to him. Lowell said Fletcher knew the difference. There was a silence in the yard that had some weather in it. Fletcher asked if he could see them. Lowell walked him into the East Bay. The drives were on their pallets, the notebook on the shelf above the nearest unit, the test records paper-clipped inside. Fletcher walked down the row slowly. He was a man who had sold and serviced conveyor equipment for 30 years, and he could look at a drive unit and know things about it the way a doctor can look at an X-ray and know things that are not immediately obvious to anyone else. He picked up the service notebook and opened it to the test records page and read through the chain pitch numbers from the 48-hour runs. He set it back on the shelf. He reached down and put his thumb on the adapter plate where it was visible between the housing and the sprocket assembly, and he pressed on it, not to test anything, just as a reflex, the way mechanics put their hands on things. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I told you those things were non-rebuildable." Lowell said, "You did." Fletcher said, "How many are you running out there?" Lowell said, 14. 0 problems. Fletcher looked at the remaining units on their pallets. He looked at the notebook on the shelf. He pulled the drive nearest to him about 6 inches forward on the pallet and looked at the adapter plate from the front, the clean mill marks on the steel, the bolt pattern that Russell had cut clean and true. He pushed the unit back. He walked out of the barn without saying anything else. He got in his truck. He sat there for a moment with the engine idling, and then he rolled his window down and said he needed Lowell to understand that operating converted equipment on commercial grain elevators created liability exposure for everyone involved. Lowell said he had spoken with his insurance agent and his attorney, and he was comfortable with where he stood. Fletcher rolled his window up and drove back toward Route 96. Have you ever watched a man drive away from a place where he just learned that something he called worthless had been running in 14 grain elevators without a single failure? Because Fletcher Dowd drove 12 miles back to Consolidated that afternoon, knowing that the drives he had stacked in his lean-to had been converted into working units by a farmer with a chain wrench and a faxed drawing and a phone call to a fabrication shop in Pittsfield. He drove back knowing that 14 of his former service customers were running those units. He drove back knowing that Lowell had been right in 1996 when he stood at the lean-to door and looked at the stacked drives and called Fletcher that evening, and Fletcher had told him the units were non-rebuildable. That is a specific kind of drive home. It does not get easier the closer you get. Let me tell you about what happened to Consolidated Ag Equipment over the years that followed. Consolidated closed in the spring of 2008. It was not fast. The slow kind of closing is never fast. It is the kind where you go from 14 employees to 10 to 7 to 4, and each reduction feels manageable at the time. And then one morning you look up and the building is too large for what is happening inside it, and the service van needs tires, and the line of credit is not what it was. Fletcher Dowd sold the Consolidated name and the remaining inventory to a competitor out of Jacksonville in January of 2008 and retired to a house in Grafton near the river. He planted a garden. He did not talk much about grain equipment. Lowell Gerber heard about the closing from Boyd Ketterman, who had heard it at the co-op. Lowell was 71 years old by then. He had been farming the same ground for 44 years. He had installed 21 of his converted drives for neighbors and co-op customers in the county and in 2 adjacent counties. 3 of the 17 he had started with were still in his own inventory, held back for replacements. He had not been called back on a single installation. His daughter, Renata Gerber, had come back to the farm in 2005 after 8 years working as a maintenance engineer for a food processing plant in Decatur. She was 38 years old when she came back, and she brought with her 8 years of watching industrial equipment run and fail and run again, and the particular kind of education that comes from being responsible for machinery that cannot stop running because the line behind it does not stop either. She had helped Lowell on the remaining drive conversions from the moment she arrived. She knew every unit in the barn. She knew the test records. She knew the adapter plate geometry and the chain pitch tolerances and the dust accommodation rationale in the same way her father knew it, which was to say she had come to understand it by working through the problem herself rather than by being told the answer. When Lowell's health began to slow him down in 2011 and The farming operation began to shift incrementally toward Renata. The east bay of the equipment barn shifted with it. Let me tell you about what Renata did with what her father had built, because this is the part that explains why the drives are still running. She did not treat the 3 remaining inventory units as equipment to be used and replaced. She treated them the way her father had treated every piece of equipment he had ever maintained, which was as objects that have a correct way to be cared for. And if you understand the correct way, the objects will outlast every expectation that was made of them. She pulled each of the 3 units from storage, disassembled them, inspected the chain for elongation, measured the sprocket tooth wear, replaced the oil bath fluid and the drain screen, checked the adapter plate bolts for torque, and put them back on the pallets with a new service record sheet clipped into the notebook. She found one unit with a chain pin showing early fatigue and replaced the chain before it became a problem. The other 2 were clean. She added a section to the notebook documenting the storage inspection. It was in her handwriting, which was neater than her father's and smaller. In 2012, a farmer and small co-op operator named Gideon Marsh, who ran a 3-bin setup east of Brussels on the ridge ground, had a drive fail during the first week of October. He was 64 years old and had been buying his service work from the Jacksonville competitor since Consolidated closed. The competitor quoted him $2,200 for a new unit installed with a 3-week lead time because the unit was not in stock. 3 weeks was not something that worked in the first week of October when the corn was coming in. Gideon Marsh had heard about Lowell Gerber's drives from Boyd Ketterman 2 years earlier. He drove to the Gerber farm on a Wednesday morning and asked Renata about them. Renata walked him through the East Bay. She showed him the notebooks. She showed him the test records her father had made in January of 1997 in his careful, blocky handwriting. She showed him the chain pitch measurements and explained what they meant in language that assumed Gideon was a man who could follow an explanation if it was given to him straight, which he was. She showed him the adapter plate and explained the geometry. She told him the drive would cost $800 installed, and she could have it in his elevator by Friday. Gideon looked at the adapter plate for a long moment. He said, "Your father made these drawings himself?" Renata said he had. Gideon said, "How long ago?" Renata said 19 he would see 59. Gideon said he would take the drive. Renata installed it on Thursday afternoon. She recorded the installation in the notebook. The amp draw was within 3% of specification. The unit ran. It ran during the entire October harvest without a single unscheduled stop, which for a grain elevator in Calhoun County in October is the only metric that ultimately matters. It is still running. Let me tell you one last thing about Lowell Gerber because he has earned it. Lowell died in February of 2016 at the age of 79. He had farmed his 480 acres for 50 years. He had maintained his own equipment for the entirety of that time, and he had never had an unscheduled conveyor shut down during a harvest run. Not once. Not in 50 years. The last entry in his equipment notebook was dated September of 2015, 6 months before he died. He had pulled one of his own converted drives for its scheduled 10-year inspection, measured the chain pitch, checked the sprocket teeth, changed the oil bath fluid, and reinstalled it. The chain pitch was within 1.5% of the manufacturer specification for new chain. He noted this in the notebook and added a single line at the bottom of the page. Chain showing good. Will run another 10 years at this rate. Renata still has the notebook. She has all the notebooks. His funeral was at the Methodist Church in Hardin on a Thursday in February. The pews were full in a way that small-town churches are full when someone has lived long enough and correctly enough that the absence of them changes the specific weight of the place. Boyd Ketterman was there. Gideon Marsh was there. Most of the 21 neighbors and co-op operators who had Lowell's converted drives running in their elevators were there, because in a county the size of Calhoun, those 21 people represent a meaningful fraction of everyone who shows up for anything. Renata sat in the front row with her husband and her 2 children. Her son Oliver was 17 and had been working alongside her in the equipment barn since he was old enough to use a pitch gauge correctly. Her daughter Kay was 14 and had opinions about everything mechanical that she had not yet learned to moderate. Fletcher Dowd was there too. He sat in the back. He was 83 years old, and his garden in Grafton had reportedly gotten very good over the years. And he sat in the back row of the Methodist Church in Hardin with his hands folded on the program and his eyes on the photograph display near the door. Renata had set out photographs of her father, Lowell in the field in 1978 with a corn head on the combine. Lowell and his wife Margaret, who had died in 2009, standing at the farmhouse door in 1983, Lowell standing in the east bay of the equipment barn in front of the first pallet of converted drives, holding one of Russell's adapter plates up toward the barn door light, looking at it, not at the camera. His hands were black with grease. His expression was the expression of a man confirming something. Fletcher looked at that last photograph for a long time. Then he set his program down on the pew and left before the reception started. Renata saw him go. She did not follow. She had drives to get back to running and a farm to carry forward, and she had learned from the man in the photograph that the only response to being underestimated is to keep doing the thing correctly until the thing speaks for itself. Let me tell you about where the drives are now. Oliver Gerber is 27 years old. He graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in agricultural systems engineering in 2019 and came home the following spring. He is farming alongside his mother and has been since before he graduated. He had a specific project in mind when he came back. He wanted to put variable speed motor controllers on the remaining active converted drives, not the variable frequency drive systems that require a complete motor replacement, but a simpler retrofit controller that modulates the existing motor's speed based on the grain flow rate coming into the elevator pit, so that the drive runs at the speed the grain requires rather than at a fixed speed regardless of load. The energy reduction, he told Renata, would be somewhere between 25 and 40%, depending on the load variability across the harvest season. He had priced the retrofit kits at approximately $800 per unit. He had a spreadsheet open on the kitchen table. Renata listened to all of it. She looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at the load data he had pulled from the elevator automation logs she had installed in 2014. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Your grandfather would have had those controllers on there already." Oliver said he knew. She said, "Do all of them." The retrofit controllers went on in the spring of 2020. Oliver installed them himself, with Renata running the electrical end. The energy bills through the following harvest season came in 31% below the pre-retrofit baseline. The drives are running right now. They are running on the Gerber farm outside of Hardin, Illinois, pulling grain through elevators that serve ground that Lowell Gerber farmed for 50 years. The motors in those drives are the same motors that Fletcher Dowd's distributor assessed as non-rebuildable in the 1990s. The adapter plates are the ones Russell milled in Pittsfield from a drawing that Lowell faxed on graph paper. The chain and sprockets have been replaced in the normal course of scheduled maintenance because chain wears predictably and predictable wear is not failure. That is the difference. The notebooks are on the shelf in the east bay of the equipment barn. They are the same spiral notebooks Lowell bought at the hardware store in Hardin. Some of them have covers that have come loose from the binding, and Renata has run electrical tape along the spine, which is exactly the kind of repair her father would have made and no more. Oliver has started keeping parallel records on a tablet. He has not mentioned this to Renata, who will eventually discover it and say nothing, because that is how things get passed on in families that understand what passing things on actually means. There is a photograph on the East Bay wall. Margaret took it in 1998. It shows Lowell standing at the first pallet of converted drives, holding an adapter plate to the light, not looking at the camera. Renata walks past it every morning. She has never moved it. Fletcher Dowd died in 2019 at 94 years old. His garden in Grafton was by all accounts exceptional. He did not come back to the Gerber farm after the afternoon in 2004 when he stood in the East Bay and read the test records and said, "I told you those things were non-rebuildable." Renata does not hold it against him. Her father never did, as far as she ever knew. The drives do not need Fletcher Dowd to have been right. They only needed Lowell Gerber to have been paying attention, which he had been, steadily and without announcement, since the day his father handed him a board and told him to hold it steady, and he understood for the first time that the most important thing about a structure is not the materials you use, but the care you take with how they fit together. 38 drives went into that barn as other people's discards. 21 of them came out as solutions. 14 of those 21 are still running in grain elevators across Calhoun County and into the counties east of the Bluffs, some of them now in their third decade of service. They are pulling grain out of ground that carries fine sand and limestone dust and the particular stubborn grit of bottomland Illinois, the same conditions that ended the useful life of the original Meridian units that replaced them. Lowell Gerber knew the conditions were not going to change. He knew it in 1996 when he stood at the lean-to door and looked at the stacked drives. He knew it when Fletcher laughed at him on the phone, and he said quietly that he understood, and then he went and got the flatbed from Art Schumacher and did the thing he had already decided to do before he made the call. Not everything becomes scrap because someone with a service territory decides it should. Sometimes things just sit in a lean-to for a few years waiting for the person who already knows what they're worth. Warren